She could have ordered on Friday night, I want to see a response by Saturday at 4 p.m. And instead, she did nothing. As usual, she didn't even mention what Trump did. And actually, it's more than what Trump did.
It's the Lawfare Podcast. I'm Benjamin Wittes. This is Trump's Trials and Tribulations, here with Quinta Jurecic and Roger Parloff.
With the facts that we have, with the law as it has been interpreted in New York courts, not saying anything about how it might stand up on appeal, it just strikes me as a pretty strong case.
Today, it's our weekly roundup in news from Fulton County, from South Florida, from Washington, D.C., and from New York City, where the jury was out when we recorded, considering charges against Donald Trump. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's Trump's Trials and Tribulations, and it has been a trial and tribulating kind of week. We have a jury out in Washington. We've had a couple hearings in Fulton County. We've had an action-packed week of Judge Cannon not doing anything except delaying things and not holding hearings on things she needs to hold hearings on in South Florida. And before we get to any of that, we're going to cover in a single word all the events in the D.C. January 6th trial. Quinta Jurecic, in one word, what has happened this week in the January 6th trial?
Well, so I'm going to use more than one word because you said we had a jury out in Washington. We have a jury out in New York.
Oh, yeah.
There is no jury in Washington because nothing has happened.
Correct. Nothing. That's the key word that we're looking for here. Nada, zilch, zero. Roger, I asked you to do some math for this week's Trump Trials and Tribulations in terms of calculating the amount of zero that has happened in Washington. If the Supreme Court were to rule today, which it did not, and were to hand down a ruling that let this case go forward, what does the math look like for getting a trial in Washington together?
Yeah, the most implausibly optimistic scenario, as you say, if the Supreme Court basically says, never mind, DC Circuit got it right, then jury selection could start August 26th with a very quick jury selection. The trial could start September 9th. The jury might get the case and start deliberating October 21st, 6 weeks later. Maybe you'd get a verdict October 24th, and that would leave 12 days before the election, November 5th. If you change any of those variables in a way that is less rosy for the government, then the scenario gets less rosy for the government.
So I had two thoughts on just hearing these numbers. One is, it seems like absent some intervening event, a trial is really quite unlikely. The second thought is, if it were to happen on that schedule, you could imagine a verdict coming down right in the middle of Quinta's black hole of horrible period. Like, that's the worst possible time frame for Trump. And so my question is there any conceivable way in your mind, and I think the answer to this is no, that you would actually have a trial on that schedule? Or does everything we know about trials tell you that that's going to slip by some number of days, out of the zone in which it's really happening in the election cycle?
Well, I really don't know whether Judge Chutkan would go forward with a trial that would, I think she might, if she had a chance, if she has a chance, I guess. But the real question is whether the Supreme Court is going to put some additional barrier in that makes it mathematically impossible to even start before the election.
Yeah. And so, of course, we have no information from the Supreme Court whatsoever. And therefore, I think we should move on from Washington. As I was saying, we have a jury out here in New York. We are going to come back to New York, but we're going to do a kind of round the horn before we get to New York. Because, people forget about all these other cases that we've got. And here on Trump's Trials and Tribulations, we do not forget about them. Let's start, Roger, in South Florida, where Judge Aileen Cannon was kind of busy this week, not deciding matters. Give us a little overview of what happened.
The most interesting thing that happened started Friday evening when Jack Smith's people filed a motion to modify conditions of release, a form of gag order. They wanted an order, Judge Cannon to make an order to make clear that Trump may not make statements that pose a significant, imminent, and foreseeable danger to law enforcement agents participating in the investigation. And this all began earlier that week. What happened was, you remember the search on Mar-a-Lago. Well, back in February, really, Trump filed a motion under seal, a motion to suppress evidence from what he calls the raid, the illegal raid on Mar-a-Lago. And that was sealed. It was finally unsealed on May 21st, which was Tuesday. And in it, his lawyers used, as you remember, the search, the FBI went out of its way to assure that Trump was not even in the state when they did this search. And they also took layer after layer of precaution that if somehow he or his family happened to show up, they would liaison with Secret Service and make sure nothing happened. But anyway, the search does include standard warrant language, and Trump's lawyers misquoted that language in their motion. They said law enforcement may use deadly force when necessary. What it says is law enforcement may use deadly force only when necessary. And then it goes on to say, and this was omitted, that deadly force is necessary only when the officer has a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent danger of death or serious physical injury to the office or another person. So the motion was filed Tuesday. It became unsealed. That evening on Truth Social, Trump began to wrote that he had just been shown reports that Joe Biden's DOJ authorized the FBI to use deadly lethal force at the raid. And then 3 hours later, Steve Bannon posted that the Mar-a-Lago search was an attempted assassination. And the next day, Trump had a campaign fundraising message in the first person saying, Biden's DOJ was authorized to shoot me. They're just itching to do the unthinkable. That's present tense, itching to do. And then continues, Joe Biden was locked and loaded, ready to take me out and put my family in danger. There was another brief. He had another the next day, and I think Marjorie Taylor Greene got in the act. And of course, the reason that this is concerning is that if you remember, the search was August 8th of 2022, and 3 days after, and immediately after it, Trump and other people began to call the FBI the Gestapo, talk about Gestapo tactics. And 3 days after it, a Trump supporter named Ricky Schiffer staged an armed attack on an FBI headquarters in Cincinnati. He fired at law enforcement. They returned fire and he was killed. He had left a message on Truth Social before doing that. And it seemed to be triggered by this sort of language. So on Friday evening, about 5 p.m., the government wanted to file a motion to get him to stop doing this. And maybe they also wanted to get the true story out. But before you can file a motion in federal court, you have to meet and confer, make an effort to meet and confer with the other side to see if they oppose the motion. And of course, very often in this case, Trump's people have said, we need more time for our meet and confer. We're very busy. We have other cases. We can't meet and confer right now. Now, in fairness, this was Friday night before Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, and in fairness as well, this is the same trial team as is currently trying the case in New York, at least in part. And so, they are actually kind of busy, although they did have Friday off.
Yeah. So they said, no, we can't meet and confer until Monday. And so you'll have to wait. And I don't think they wanted to wait to get the word out that these dangerous lies were false. So they went forward with the motion, and they explained in a footnote that the other side opposed and said that they hadn't done adequate meet and confer. And then on the 27th, which is Monday, Blanche filed a response. He didn't respond to the merits of the motion. He simply sought sanctions, 15 pages about the failure to comply with the meet and confer, a requirement of the local rules. And then Cannon weighed in the next day, denied Blanche also sought sanctions. He sought an evidentiary hearing. So the next day, Cannon denied the government's motion without prejudice, scolded them again. The court finds the special counsel's pro forma conferral to be wholly lacking in substance and professional courtesy. It should go without saying that meaningful conferral is not a perfunctory exercise. She did deny Blanche's counter motion for the sanctions and for evidentiary hearing, but she did impose onerous new rules for every single new motion filed about what you have to do with respect to the meet and confer. You can't just put in a footnote what you did about it. You have to lay it out at the end, and you have to give the other side up to 200 words to give their verbatim version of, you do this in your motion, their version of the meet and confer efforts. Anyway, it seems to be over. We haven't had a new filing by the government. Maybe, I imagine they've sort of given up on it, but that's where that one stands.
Well, why would they have given up on it?
Well, if she had felt any urgency whatsoever, maybe I'm wrong, but if she had felt any urgency whatsoever, she could have ordered, on Friday night, I want to see a response by Saturday at 4 p.m. And instead, she did nothing. And as soon as the other side, as usual, she didn't even mention what Trump did. And actually, it's more than what Trump did. It's partly what his lawyers did. They were the ones that misrepresented what happened, maybe by mistake, but
there was a material misquote of
yes
in their file.
Yeah, and a material omission. And as usual, there's just zero reference at all to either Trump or to his lawyers. It's all, the special counsel was not very gentle. And the other factor, of course, is that this wasn't the special counsel's first rodeo on a gag order with Trump lawyers. They know the Trump lawyers there is no way in the world that they will agree to any gag order. And in fact, even though they didn't address the merits of the government's motion, in passing, they said, not only was the proposal patently unconstitutional, but the DC Circuit's gag order was unconstitutional. So I mean, there was no point to a meet and confer. And if, in light of what happened in Cincinnati, there was urgency to this. And it's just utterly, it doesn't permeate. There's no evidence of it. She's closed to any discussion that might offend Trump or his counsel.
Right. But if I were the government, I would be looking at this as a potentially appealable denial. And so if they were to actually go ahead and refile this after appropriate non-urgent consultations and conferrals, and you go through that process and then you file it and you force her to deny it, that's appealable on an interlocutory basis, right? And then maybe you can say to the 11th Circuit, hey, this judge is with this incredible pattern of bias against the government, is now tolerating this defendant threatening law enforcement, putting law enforcement officers in danger in an environment in which a jury is out in New York, not in Washington, and he's ginning up threats as well against the judge in that case. That's a heck of from my point of view, stepping into Jack Smith's shoes, I kind of like that record as a basis to get her in front of the 11th Circuit again. What am I missing?
Well, he can try that. I think that with each passing day that nobody's killed, and that's sort of the calculus here. She was willing to take that risk. No one has been killed so far, and so
nobody's ever killed until the day somebody's killed. But the more time that passes, she can say, well, there's no particularized need. Their position is that none of the actual FBI agents have been named so far. And of course, she wanted to, she was going to, but then special counsel moved to reconsider, and she did successfully prevail on her not to reveal the names of almost 24 FBI agents who participated in this. But I don't know. It would be nice to see, but I think with each day it becomes less likely, each passing day. So, Quinta, you shared this morning internally some information about threats to Justice Merchan, which I wasn't planning to bring up in this context, except that it is immediately relevant to this. What do we know about the threat environment in the New York court scene, where, by the way, I was accosted on the street the other day by a gentleman with recording equipment and a very angry demeanor? There's like bad stuff going on all over the place.
Sure. So this is related to an article that came out, I believe, today from NBC by Ryan Riley, that is about a sort of I don't even really know what to call it, meme that sort of went around the conservative right-wing media ecosystem yesterday after the jury received its charging instructions. That we can, I don't know if we want to get into the details here, but the short version is that Trump and his allies were promoting a very misleading version of how Justice Merchan instructed the jury in such a way as to make it sound like the justice had been unfair to Trump as the defendant. And according to Ryan, there were a number of really disturbing comments that were posted to far-right forums, including the network Gab, saying, talking about finding where Merchan lives, calling for his hanging, calling for him to be executed for treason. And so, this is a dynamic that is, I think, very familiar at this point, where Trump will kind of put out something incendiary and there'll be a surge of threatening, harassing statements that sort of come out there. I don't think from this story that there's anything, we know anything about whether anyone attempted to act on those threats, or whether these are more in the realm of sort of threatening, harassing social media posts. But I do think it speaks to the dynamics here. And also, the fact that this was totally predictable. I'll give a shout out to our colleague Tyler McBrien, who is in the courthouse right now waiting for a potential verdict, who, when this sort of idea started circulating on the right yesterday, made the comment on Twitter that this was potentially really dangerous and could put the judge's safety at risk, or potentially that of the jury. And lo and behold, here we are. So I think this is a very, very familiar pattern at this point, whether or not Judge Cannon wants to recognize it as such.
Yes, and it is also important to emphasize, and Quinta has been very careful not to repeat the nonsense that has driven.
I mean, we can talk about the nonsense. I just wasn't sure if we wanted to get into the details.
I don't want to go into the nonsense.
Okay.
I do want to emphasize that the nonsense has not one grain of truth to it, and is exactly the kind of thing that a errant journalist can do, and the president can spin into a quite dangerous information attack with, or the former president, with a fair bit of impunity. But I think it actually, to go back to Roger's initial point, it shows that there is a very direct relationship between the things the former president says, particularly in all caps, and things that people contemplate doing to law enforcement officers, or in this case to a judge. And this is not an idle problem, and you never know how seriously to take it until something awful happens, or until 6 months later something awful hasn't happened and you feel like an idiot. And so I think this is a very different picture if you're looking at it from Jack Smith's point of view, or I suspect from Justice Merchan's point of view, than if you're looking at it from Todd Blanche's point of view. But to go back to my point, if I were Jack Smith here, I would find this a very attractive fact pattern to get in front of Judge Pryor and his colleagues, because one thing the 11th Circuit judges are unlikely to look at the way Judge Cannon looks at is threats to active duty law enforcement personnel.
I mean, one point that I think is worth noting here is that I don't know. So this is in the realm of speculation, and I want to couch it in the most responsible way possible. That, every judge, or many of the judges that have found themselves on Trump's bad side, have been targeted with threats and harassment. And we know this because there's been reporting to that effect. There's been, indictments, in one instance, for example, of a woman who called up Judge Chutkan's chambers in DC with threatening, harassing, racist language. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that if Judge Cannon started ruling against Trump on any of these issues, that at a certain point he would come after her as well. And the reason why I have no doubt in my mind is that we have seen this happen over and over again. If you were following the New York trial, you saw how he went from praising Michael Cohen in his tweets during his presidency to really going after him as viciously as possible. And so I do think that there's a little bit of a absence of forethought, let's say, on Judge Cannon's part, or perhaps a confidence that she is situated differently, or alternatively, an awareness on her part that her own safety may be to some extent the lack of threats against her may be to some extent contingent on her staying within Trump's good graces. Again, I want to be clear. This is speculative. I don't know anything, but that I have been wondering about that dynamic. Roger, I don't know if you think I'm going out on a limb here.
No, and there's, in addition to the threat against Chutkan, there was a threat against Alvin Bragg that's being prosecuted federally, and in fairness, there's a threat against Cannon from an anti-Trump guy that is being prosecuted, and I think that person's been convicted after she intervened after the search. I think there was a threat against her, so she knows how this stuff works. But she is astoundingly unmoved by it. Maybe she is an absolutist in First Amendment matters, so I don't know.
All right. So what else has been going on in her court that we should know about, Roger? Has she cleared the decks of all the pending motions that she has before her?
No, not just yet. She has dug herself out of, I think, the undocketed docket, but there was something that happened yesterday. There's one of the hearings that's coming up on June 21st is one that says that the special counsel has been unconstitutionally appointed and unlawfully funded. So yesterday, she did issue an order for additional briefing on the funding issue in light of a Supreme Court ruling that just came down, which was actually 7-2, that overruled the conservative Fifth Circuit, which had said that there was something unconstitutional about funding for the consumer
board.
Yeah. So she wants some more ruling on that. I have not pored over these motions, but I am developing a doomsday scenario on the horizon, a real fear, because I think on the other motions, she is avoiding having an appeal to the 11th Circuit because of a fear of reassignment if she gets it, outlandishly wrong. Here, this stuff about, the special counsel is unconstitutionally appointed, which is being argued by, people like Steve Calabresi, one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society, and Ed Meese has joined that brief. And this is a real cause célèbre in the right-wing community. And of course, this is something that Clarence Thomas he even brought it up at the immunity argument. He said, out of the blue, he said, have you challenged special counsel here? So even though it hadn't been briefed, it's something he's itching to get to, and they might have the votes at this point. And so if she were to rule even incorrectly for this right-wing view that the special counsel is improperly appointed, that might be a hill she would happily temporarily die on, both because it might go up to the Supreme Court and she'd win. It would burnish her credentials with the people she wants to burnish them with. And it would also throw a wrench, possibly in both cases, depending on.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this argument is dumb and it's going nowhere. This argument has been kicking around since Steve Calabresi made it during the Mueller investigation. It was decisively rebutted, I want to say, by one George Conway in his first public article after emerging from his shell of silence. He wrote a lengthy article about this on a publication called Lawfare. The argument has no merit whatsoever, and I don't see it having... I don't think it has 3 votes on the Supreme Court. The special counsel is, the argument is rooted in the dissent in Morrison v. Olson, and it just has no legs. And so I would love to see her dismiss it on this basis, and that be the basis for it to go up to the 11th Circuit, because the one thing I'm certain of in this case is that Jack Smith is constitutionally appointed, and there are not 5 votes on the Supreme Court to say otherwise.
Well, I hope that's true. This argument might not be identical to what you've seen before. And like I say, I need to pore over these things, but he focuses on the fact that he draws a distinction. This is between Jack Smith, who was not Senate approved, and the special counsel in the Hunter Biden matter, he's a U.S. attorney. And so that's one focus where I wonder if she might be willing to go with that argument, that that's the source of the problem, and not quite the full-blown no special counsel can exist, but this flavor of it that would just throw a mammoth wrench in both investigations and further burnish her credentials if need be, as a right wing.
Although then you'd end up arguing that Robert Herr's appointment as special counsel was unconstitutional.
Right. I just say, if she wants to go down this road, bring it on. I think that's a fine one. I love that. All right. We have some action in Fulton County. Quinta, Jurecic, you are our acting Anna Bauer today, because Anna and Tyler are in court. So you are doing the Fulton County beat on a kind of stand-in basis. What's been going on in before Boy Wonders Court in Georgia?
Yes, I'm going to do this at a higher altitude than Anna usually provides, because I am kind of parachuting in. So we had some hearings in Judge McAfee's court. It seems like they were relatively uneventful. So Georgia State Senator Sean Still, say that 3 times fast, was looking to dismiss some of the counts against him on a variety of reasons, some of which had to do with very technical arguments over the definition of what constitutes a forged document. So there was a hearing on that this week. Judge McAfee said that he would rule on those motions later on. We also had a hearing with defendants Harrison Floyd and Trevian Kutti. Trevian Kutti, very simple. Essentially, she lost her counsel. Judge McAfee wanted to confirm that she has new counsel. She does. In Harrison Floyd's case, he is trying to defend against the charges against him by essentially taking the, I think, pretty gutsy approach of arguing that the 2020 election actually was stolen, and so has been attempting to subpoena an enormous amount of data from Fulton County in order to help him make that argument. So Judge McAfee did not prevent him from following this route, but did essentially ask him to narrow his subpoenas somewhat, so it's a bit less of a heavy lift for the county officials. And that's what we have in Fulton County.
And there's no evidence of movement at all in the Georgia Court of Appeals, right? There's we haven't seen any filings or sign of life on that appeal.
I'm not aware of any.
All right. All of which brings us back to New York, where I am getting ready to strip down the Lawfare Hype House and pack it all up and drive it all back to Washington. Roger, this week you wrote a groundbreaking and fascinating article repenting your prior skepticism about this case and saying that Donald Trump is the moral equivalent of Al Capone, and we should get him for spitting on the sidewalk. Is that a fair summary of your piece?
Not quite, but aspects of it. What I was doing was trying to look at the way this case really evolved, and looking at what Special Assistant District Attorney Mark Pomerantz had written about it. You know, he wrote this book. He was, Cy Vance had him lead the investigation from about February 2021 till about the same time, 2022. And, you know, the first thing that had struck him was that he wanted to pursue a enterprise corruption case, which is basically New York State's Little RICO Act. And because the evidence before him suggested that, you know, he had been for many years operating Trump Organization through a pattern of criminal activity. And there was already some civil rulings about, by that time, his foundation had been dissolved for persistent wrongdoing. His, you know, Trump University had been litigated and had led to that was a consumer fraud case, had led to a settlement where about 90% of all the money sought was paid. And then there was this evidence already, which the New York Attorney General's office was developing, about persistent fraud relating to his false financial statements for more than a decade. And then there was the evidence that the organization was guilty of criminal tax fraud. So that was he felt that was fully predicated. Enterprise corruption is like maximum theoretically of 25 years, and there's a minimum mandatory of 1 year. And of course, he brought the criminal cases against Trump Organization and Weisselberg, but Weisselberg did not flip, and he got bogged down, and he felt in these cases, felt that he just didn't have the bandwidth to go forward with enterprise corruption, and he began to focus on what the case that became the civil case before Engeron about the false financial statements. He wanted to charge that as criminal. So the bottom line is there was this pattern, this history, this persistent fraud in 100 different ways. And when he was thinking about, well, would enterprise corruption have been overkill? His view was to look at Al Capone, and that sometimes, and of course, this is obviously, he was believed to be the kingpin bootlegger who orchestrated lots of violence, but all they could get him on was tax. And he felt that, when there is this evidence of this persistent wrongdoing and elusiveness and familiarity with how to avoid prosecution, and everyone around him is going down. Weisselberg pled to 15 counts, and his closely held corporation was convicted of 17 counts, that it made sense to go after, the question was, do you go after him for nothing criminally, or do you go after him with what you have? And he wanted to do that. Now, obviously, when Bragg took over, he didn't agree about and I guess I shouldn't go into the whole thing, but he didn't want to pursue the false statements case, but he pursued the hush money case, which was one that Pomerantz also thought was worthy. He just didn't want to bring it alone. He was concerned about whether on appeal it might be, cut down to a misdemeanor. But so I was trying to give a feel for, this didn't arise in a vacuum. It's not an isolated case. It's somebody that has been, where these civil judgments mean nothing to him. And the feeling was, you have to do something. You have to go after him criminally. There needs to be accountability at a criminal level. And when I saw the evidence, I didn't see it. I wasn't there like Quinta and you all, but I was closely following it. It's really appalling, and so in that context, it all made sense to me.
So having now watched the case, albeit through a filter, you were, I think, the person in the Lawfare immediate orbit who was most down on the case at the beginning, at the time of filing and over the course of the last year. Where would you say you were on a scale of 1 to 10 in 10 is the most enthusiastic, 1 is the worst? Where were you and where are you now? Like, how has the needle moved?
Well, I'm still extremely disappointed. This was the first case to go and will probably be the only case to go. I mean, that is a real terrible injustice. But to me, initially, I was down on it because I thought it would have strong overtones of extortion. Those really sort of melted away. And what it had strong overtones of was somebody who regularly and reflexively meets every challenge with blizzards of lies and to conceal revolting, criminal, disgusting behavior. And, that has an effect. Even on its own, it spoke, the more I soaked in it and marinated it, the more worthwhile the case seemed. But when you look at it in the context also, then it just seems overwhelming. You really have to do something. It's unfortunate that it was the first, but
Quinta, how about you? How has your attitude toward this case? You were, as I recall, kind of a moderate on this case. You reserved judgment. You weren't particularly down on it, but you weren't actively defending it either. How have your views of it changed as you've watched the evidence presentation and the arguments?
Well, so I think I should say, I think I was initially more moderate on it because when it was first charged, the DA's office did not provide an enormous amount of material by the way of evidence. We didn't have a sense of what the legal theory was. We didn't have a sense of what evidence they had on the table. So I think I was in the wait and see camp. But look, I mean, I have always thought that this conduct on Trump's part was worthy of condemnation in a more serious way than I think it's merited. I argued in 2018 that it was an impeachable offense, but not one that demanded impeachment, which is a distinction that we don't have to get into here. But I do think that the conduct is serious. And after having read through the filings and tried to kind of pick apart the legal theory and followed the case as closely as I was able, it just seems like a pretty strong case to me. And I think that some of that is also the fact that the law in question, the business records falsification law, is just very friendly to prosecutors. It's very flexible. There's a relatively low burden of proof for the object offense that bumps it up to a felony. New York courts have interpreted things pretty flexibly in terms of allowing prosecutors kind of leeway. And so I think that that is also important to understanding the dynamics here. I do think that there is kind of a dynamic that's happening right now on social media, really on Twitter, where as we're waiting for the verdict, lawyers and legal commentators are, kind of speculating on different kinds of issues that could show up at the appellate level and how, asking whether it was a mistake for the prosecution or the judge to not do this, that, or the other thing. And my feeling is kind of that, at that point, you're really asking, Justice Merchan to make constitutional judgments that really have no role in this case, and given that he is a trial lawyer. So with the facts that we have, with the law as it has been interpreted in New York courts, not saying anything about how it might stand up on appeal, it just strikes me as a pretty strong case. Now, I don't know what way the jury will rule, but those are kind of my 2 cents. And I will also say that I think there is a power in its own way for the first case being something that is run-of-the-mill. Sounds like a weird thing to say in this context, given how absurd and grotesque a lot of the details of the case are. But I do think that the sort of mundane nature of this case, it's not in a grand federal courtroom. It's a New York State court. The building is kind of crummy. The air conditioning doesn't really work.
You're getting to my overriding point that this is the Trump case we all deserve.
Well, but I don't know if I actually agree with that. I think what I'm trying to say more is that he has always been able to position himself as above or outside the law. And I think having the first case be something that isn't particularly grand is in itself a kind of powerful statement about the fact that, Trump can be prosecuted for falsification of business records, just like my 2 favorite cases, the woman who gave false returns to Lord and Taylor and was prosecuted for first-degree falsification of business records, or the guy who attached jumper cables to his electricity meter on his house and was charged with first-degree falsification for theft and creating false records at the electricity company. These are all like very minor, kind of petty, dumb seeming crimes, but I think that the run-of-the-mill nature of them is in part what makes this stand out to me. And I think what is so interesting about the way the prosecutors brought the case, when Alvin Bragg gave a press conference announcing the charges, the way that he framed it, he's moved since more towards sort of emphasizing the election interference aspect. But at the time, what he basically said is, New York is the business capital of the world. It is important to us that, New York businesses keep their records straight. And that's what this is. And I think that thinking about it in that kind of quasi run-of-the-mill way is an interesting way to look at things.
All right. We are going to go to audience questions. Josh asks, suppose the DC trial starts before but finishes after the election. Even if, horror of horrors, Trump wins, he doesn't take office until late January. So I will say that my colleague Scott Anderson and I did a substantial presentation on some combination of and permutations of questions like this. It is available on the Lawfare podcast, as well as on YouTube, I think, with a snazzy PowerPoint. We actually put it together for a foundation that wanted a briefing on the subject, and we thought it was fun enough and wild enough that we kind of recorded it as a podcast and made it public. Look, the short answer is Trump remains a private citizen and subject to trial until January 2025. He presumably at that point cannot be tried further or held in prison, at least, and all state trials would, one way or another, have to go into abeyance at that point if he were elected. But theoretically, you could start a trial, have him elected, and have the trial finish up in December, give the jury a month to deliberate, and then have him convicted and then become president the next day. That there is nothing that would prevent that other than the good sense of the American people, if you believe in that. William asks, after New York conviction, can Trump expect to be cut any slack from the entity he referred to in the hallway as a, quote, good appellate. I know it's a different court from the one that slashed his bond. So I will say the following about the New York appellate process. First of all, it will take longer than the relevant period of time. And so whatever you think about the merits of a Trump appeal, the matter will not be resolved before the election. And so, in fact, I guess it will be filed at that point. And maybe we will have seen an appellate brief, but these things take a good long time. And so you're not starting with the idea that this would be a resolved question. Number two, sorry, go ahead.
And we're all assuming your assumption of a conviction.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no appeal if there's no conviction, of course. The second issue is what would the appealed issue be? And I think people are quick to gloss over this because people don't like to actually learn anything about New York law. But, this is a state proceeding, and there are a million issues that the president's lawyers reserved for possible appeal, and some of them are non-trivial. As with all criminal trials, you object to a lot of things, and you're not actually going to appeal on those bases, but you preserve the issue in case it becomes relevant somehow. There are a few issues that are not trivial. And as with any case, Justice Merchan has made a few decisions that are, I think, clear. We're clearly circling something about the nature of the step up as one of the bases for appeal. That is a question of New York law only. And so, if the New York courts resolve that in the fashion that Justice Merchan seems confident that they will, that's not something you can take to federal court. One thing Trump has to be thinking about is how to get the Supreme Court of the United States to look at this. And that means he's got to think up some way that this presents a substantial federal issue, which it does not, obviously, on its face. And so that brings us to in reference to campaign finance law, which is your most obvious gateway into federal law. And so I think part of the art of the appeal, which is different from the art of the deal, the art of the appeal here is going to be for Trump, not necessarily to make his best New York case, but to make his best appeal for subsequent appeal to federal courts, either by direct appeal to the Supreme Court from the New York Court of Appeals or on some habeas theory later on. But I think the appeal is going to be very complicated. And honestly, one of the reasons I think that is that having sat in court for the whole time, I think Justice Merchan did a really good job. And so there's no glaring moment in this court case that stood out to me as like, oh, this is where the appeals court's really gonna come down on this case. There is some good trial work here, and I think there's a lot of this is going to stand up very well. Sorry, Roger, I droned on a long time there.
No, you got to. I was just going to mention that the federal hook, the federal campaign issue, and then I think the issue about, regardless of what New York law is, do you need to be? Do you need a special verdict form? Do you need unanimity on whatever is unlawful about the state conspiracy to influence the election by unlawful means, which is the object crime? Do you need a do you need unanimity on that sub point? And although that wouldn't, I don't think they would ordinarily take that. I think this court might take that.
That's what I was gonna flag as well. I mean, I will also say, Ben, to your point, that Justice Merchan has done a really good job. There has been a lot of commentary, like I said on Twitter, along the lines of like, how could Justice Merchan have made such an obvious, stupid mistake in not addressing X, Y, and Z? I think that's really misplaced. He's done a tremendous job under really, really difficult circumstances. Obviously, we are not shy about criticizing judges when we think they need to be criticized. But I think he's done really good work. And, he's been faced with questions that may be somewhat unresolved, but his decisions have always made a great deal of sense to me. And I think he's explained them quite clearly under New York law, which is binding on him. He is not an appellate judge here. He doesn't get to just say, you know what, I've interpreted the Supreme Court precedent to mean X if New York appellate courts have determined that it means Y.
I think there are a lot of pundits who are federal practitioners, and Merchan is a veteran state judge, and the DA's office does this a day in and day out. And I think they know what they're doing. And
this is a really important dynamic in the commentary of this case, about this case, is how many of the pundits are federal practitioners who actually know very little about New York state law and practice, and just impute the way the federal system works. I'm not saying anybody's doing it in bad faith, but there's a lot of confident talk about the way the system works that is much more applicable across the street in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York than it is here. And the group of people who have practiced in this court on a routine basis and dealt with questions like this are often not the people who are on television a lot.
Oh, by the way, somebody wants to know if Ben will give Merchan sort of middle-aged boy wonder status.
No.
Adult man wonder.
Adult man wonder. No. We don't hand out phrases like that. Boy wonder got that status because he looks like he's 12. And he's, by the way, maybe 13. And he's handling a case with 19 co-defendants and 2 prosecutors who happen to be having an affair and giving each other wads of cash. You gotta, that's an unusual circumstance. And all jokes aside, Scott McAfee is the only one who's getting a title here. Jokes aside, Justice Merchan has done a remarkable job here, and he's done it under circumstances of, the former president is coming out every day before the trial and after the trial and attacking him and his family. He's doing it in a malicious and aggressive fashion that actually causes real security issues, and that courthouse is not set up for this. None of this is normal. And there's we should appreciate, and I say that not knowing what the jury's going to do, not knowing whether he's going to have to try the case again, for crying out loud. He's really done a remarkable job here. All right. Will asks, assuming that the special counsel's office satisfactorily confers with the defense and refiles the motion to modify conditions of release, do you think another denial of the motion would be grounds for the SCO to seek Cannon's removal from the case? Also, Cannon called out the SCO for arguing that the motion was not urgent as described by the SCO and noted it was not filed on an emergency basis. Do you think that was a strategic mistake by the SCO in filing this motion? So what do you think, Roger, if they follow the Wittes theory and take her up on this, how does that work for them?
It is sort of a problem that, I think what their calculation was a sensible one. It was, we can't let this go unanswered till Monday. It's getting out of control. you have all of his people jumping on this and magnifying and amplifying, and it's a lie and somebody needs to say it. And on the other hand, do we need to haul everybody back into court on an emergency basis over Memorial Day weekend? And they made the call that, if they filed this, it would get Trump to knock it off, which it seems to have done. I think I don't know. I don't monitor Truth Social, so that may have been the calculation. And so unless it has continued and there's more evidence that it's getting worse, or I would not go just based on the record as it existed as of Friday afternoon.
All right. So we have a few duplicates of that question that frame it in slightly different ways, and I will take that as the one time we're going to present this question. Anonymous attendee asks, in the New York case, I was wondering if you were able to assess the performance of Todd Blanche. In the lead up to the trial, everyone said Trump has a real lawyer now, but based on reporting, it seemed like he was mostly underwhelming. I can't imagine wanting a crying little shit representing him. And I also can't imagine a crying little shit would make partner at a law firm. What gives? Okay, so I'm going to give, I think, a politically unpopular answer to this question, which is that I think Todd Blanche did a fine job. Not a great job. I thought his opening argument was very good. I thought his closing argument was a kind of B+. I was the high grader among the Lawfare group in that regard. Most others gave him a B-, but I thought he was fine. I thought he was a very lousy cross-examiner during the trial. I thought he did a lousy job with the witnesses that he handled. He also has a very hard job. This is a case where the evidence is pretty damn strong and very unflattering to his client. And yes, his argument style before the judge comes across as whiny. I do think that's something he needs to work on. But I am not a Todd Blanche basher. I don't like if Donald Trump loses this case and gets convicted, it will not be because he had ineffective assistance of counsel. It would not be because there was some great argument available to his lawyers that they did not make. Now, is he the standout lawyer on the Trump legal team? No. The one who actually, I think, is really first rate and, I really enjoyed watching and thought was just a very high performance defense lawyer was Emil Bovee. I was not particularly impressed with Susan Necklace, who everybody sang the praises of and talks about how wonderful a lawyer she is. I did not think her cross of Stormy Daniels was effective at all. Emil Bovee really impressed me. But I don't think Todd Blanche did a bad job. And I think the fundamental problem here is that the client is guilty. And I think the client also probably put some constraints on his counsel to be more bombastic and than the case necessarily required that he be. So I don't want to bash Todd Blanche, and I don't want to make fun of him. I think he was a lawyer who did a reasonable job and I've watched a lot of cases. I've watched a lot of lawyers who have difficult clients, and this was not a terrible performance. And it was nothing, by the way, like, Alina Habba this was professional counsel. There are strategic judgments that people will reasonably question. There were cautions that people would have, but this was not a badly handled case. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but that's my answer.
I will say I found Blanche really off, but I'm also not the target audience. So I don't know how much my opinion matters. I will say, as you said, Emil Bovee is a pleasure to have in class. I did not really get to see Susan Necklace in action, so I can't gauge that. I think there is an extent to which Blanche has a kind of a similar, I don't really know how to put it, like presentation in the courtroom. There's a way that he seems to really be sort of on the same wavelength with Trump. There's a kind of like pleading, like both pleading and bullying quality to his presence, that you can kind of see why Trump might find that appealing in Counsel, since that is also the way that he presents himself. And I mean, if you've seen the photos of Trump and Blanche standing in that courtroom hallway, Blanche kind of stands next to him with the same like, shoulders squared, sort of frowny expression. So that may be, he's fashioning himself to his client's needs. It may be that this is his style and it happens to be a particularly good fit for what Trump is looking for. I don't know. I don't think that, as we've said, Trump has had disastrous lawyers like Alina Habba. There are plenty of other Trump lawyers who really, really crashed and burned in kind of spectacular ways. Blanche is definitely not in that category, but I do think that, like, if you can kind of chop Trump lawyers into different categories of, lawyers who happen to be representing Trump, lawyers who are representing Trump and seem to be kind of simpatico to him on some sort of characterological level, and then lawyers who are representing Trump because only Trump would hire them because they're unbelievably bad lawyers. So Alina Habba is in that category. I think I would put Blanche in category 2 rather than category 1, but he's maybe kind of straddling them both.
So I would just ask the following of the Blanche skeptical, which you're not a great representative of, but like, it seems to me—
I'm soft Blanche skeptical.
Yeah, soft Blanche. It's Blanche skeptical adjacent. It seems to me if you're going to criticize a lawyer in a criminal, in a defense of a criminal case, it's not enough to say that you find the manner off-putting, which as I say, he does come off as whiny. He's not a pleasure to listen to the way Bovee is. That said, it seems to me you don't get to file a habeas case that says I had ineffective assistance of counsel because my lawyer's annoying, right? You have to be able to make an argument that there were serious arguments that should have been presented to the court that were not, that there were lines of questioning that should have been developed, there was evidence that should have been discovered, there was some defense that was available. And it seems to me that one thing Todd Blanche certainly did is he methodically went over all the evidence. He attacked the witnesses, including in ways that I didn't necessarily think were appropriate. I'm not sure, like, what's the argument that was supposed to be made on Donald Trump's behalf that Blanche Law did not make? And I just think that the answer to that question, in my heart of hearts, I think, is that Blanche made every argument and then a few that could reasonably be made on behalf of Donald Trump. He zealously represented his client. And the reason it's not successful is that his client is fucking guilty. And that I'm just not sure that there's like, that's not at the end of the day a lawyer problem.
So I think that the limitations of Blanche's performance is more in the arguments that he did make that he shouldn't have. So specifically, the repeated insistence that Trump never interacted with or slept with Stormy Daniels, or, sort of weird arguments that would kind of seemed like they were maybe aimed at appeasing the client, but did not actually advance the case that he was trying to make.
But again, we have no idea
Sure.
who's negatively impacted the jury, and we have no idea whether he had any choice about making those arguments. And so I just want to, I just think like people have a lot of fun making fun of the president's lawyers, and sometimes that's really justified because sometimes they're Alina Habba and sometimes they're Michael Cohen, who was, quite laughable in his own way. But like this was a professionally presented defense. And I think a lot of the people who were making fun of him don't actually know what defense law work looks like, and that you're often up there making ridiculous arguments because you represent guilty people. And I just don't think like Todd Blanche was solidly in the upper quartile of defense lawyering that I've seen. Not the top 2%, but this was a perfectly professionally presented defense. I don't know, Roger, you've been very quiet. What are you're going to tell me I'm completely wrong?
No, I wasn't up there. So I think he probably, he hasn't had a lot of criminal defense experience. He's mainly a prosecutor. And, he's got this weird client who is making him do crazy things and whose probably cares more about the election than about, whether or not he's convicted. And so, if he wins a thing like he did with, that one little moment in the Cohen cross, and even CNN gets carried away and says, he just won the case. His people just need a foothold to say, Cohen lied. He's a liar. I don't have to listen to anymore. So, that's a big moment. And like you say, it was better than that. It was, I think it was perfectly, what filtered through to me was perfectly competent.
Shannon, who I trust is safe from all tornadoes, asks, what happens if Trump is found guilty? Will he be taken into custody? The answer to that question is almost certainly not. We don't know. What will happen is that Justice Merchan will set a sentencing timeline, and we will start a process of pre-sentence activity and briefing on sentencing. I assume he will remain free on bond, barring any outrageous conduct on his part. Justice Merchan clearly does not want to lock him up other than perhaps by sentencing. And I think we can expect him to walk out of court and give a press conference that will denounce the court and all its works. All right. A question for Roger. Watching Cannon's confirmation Zoom in a loop, what jumps out to me is a case of serious arrested development. You were in her court. Does that impression clash with your observations? I'm not sure I know what this refers to.
I don't know. I don't know either half of it. I don't know about the confirmation Zoom, and if arrested development means a particular TV show, I don't know the show. If it means a psychological term, I'm not sure what it means either. She does there is sort of an OCD-ish thing, and I am not a professional. I've never met her except I've watched her, and there is an insecurity that comes across, and there is an ambition to move up to the 11th Circuit and maybe beyond. And so she is always being, she wants to be an A++ student. She is extraordinarily prepared for, silly motions, and more prepared than, like at one point last week, she asked Stanley Woodward about one of the many things he complained about, and he couldn't even remember what it was. He said, excuse me, Judge, I can't really remember that one offhand. And she said, well, you should have been prepared. And a lot of young people are like this. I was like this. She's positioning herself with everything she writes. she's positioning herself as a, major right-wing thinker, a textualist, plain meaning person, a no-nonsense person, although this is her self-perception, and she's grooming herself. And frankly, I think she's going to succeed.
All right. We have only time for one more question, which I think Jeff represents a lot of people who have asked me this. How was the experience of covering the Trump New York trial in such detail? And will this be Lawfare's model for future Trump trials? So the answer is the experience was extremely exhausting for everybody involved. I am certain among all publications produced the most number of words unit human hour human body deployed on the story. We produced an enormous volume of material. I'm exceptionally proud of the work that the team did, both in broadcast and form, and in from the courtroom, and also and especially the analytic work that we did not from the courtroom by people like Roger and Quinta. I thought the output was extraordinary, and it is definitely a model for how we will do it in the future. We are always looking to refine models and do things better and more efficiently, assuming the next case is the January 6th case, which is a reasonable but not certain assumption. We will be on our home turf, which gives us a lot of natural advantages, including access to our home base and access to the Goat Rodeo studios, which will by itself resolve all technical difficulties that we've had deploying stuff from here. So our subsequent coverage will be also involving cases that are more in our core issue areas than this one, which was a little bit at the margins. So I expect we will do more than we did in this one, both for reasons of geography and for reasons that our expertise is a little bit more on point. Our experience with, the adult film industry and, the tabloid industry is pretty limited, but our experience with classified documents and, counterintelligence investigations and coups and things, that we know a lot about that stuff. So that is the answer to that question. Thank you for it. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Folks, if you're watching this on YouTube and you're thinking, why did we get a question from the estimable Lindsay Chervinsky, famed presidential historian, and not from me? The answer is because she's a material supporter of Lawfare and joins us in the Zoom, and you're not. You should come into the light, be like Lindsay, and then I'll answer your questions and congratulate you on your really cool next job when you come on the show next time. They don't do that on MSNBC or on CNN or on Fox News, but we do that here on Lawfare, and you should join us. If you can't do that, you can't do the monthly contributions, we totally understand. Hey, there's the Give Butter thing. Just support our Trump coverage, Trump trials coverage. $1, $2, 50 cents, whatever it is. Do what you can. An apartment in Tribeca to cover this thing, it was not cheap. With that, I'm signing off from the Scott studio, Roger Parloff, from the Brookings office studio with the endless screen Edvard Munch pillow, Quinta Jurecic. The pillow's turned to the side, so you can't actually see the screen anymore. I'm here in the Lawfare Hype House, Ben Wittes signing off. We will be back as soon as there's a verdict.